that the spike in energy prices due to the conflict will be temporary. Yesterday, President Trump said he was demanding countries that rely on oil from the Middle East join the U.S. in forming a coalition to secure the strait.
Look, pay attention to this for a second, because what I'm about to show you about the Strait of Hormuz didn't make the headlines, and yet it may be changing the course of an entire conflict. In recent days, a nearly invisible move happened in the Strait of Hormuz, and most people simply ignored it. No missiles were launched, no ships were attacked, no crisis was officially declared. But one detail changed, and that detail is exactly the kind of thing that, historically, comes before major global turning points. Because it wasn't an accident, and it certainly wasn't random. It was a decision that directly involves Iran. And if you understand what's really happening here, you'll realize this isn't just about oil or a shipping route. It's about control. Control over who sets the rules of the global game. And the most concerning part isn't what has already happened. It's what this makes possible from now on. Because when a single silent move starts to bypass a system that took decades to build, history shows that two things can happen. Either the system adapts, or it begins to collapse. And that's exactly where we are right now. Now let me show you why this seemingly small move is much bigger than it looks. When we talk about the Strait of Hormuz, we're not talking about just any route on the map. We're talking about the most sensitive choke point in the global energy system. Roughly 1/5 of all the oil consumed in the world passes through that narrow corridor every single day. Mainly coming from countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. In other words, any change there isn't regional. It's global. And that's exactly why, for decades, that area has been under constant surveillance, especially by the United States and its allies. But what just happened breaks completely from the usual pattern. Because Iran didn't block the strait, it didn't threaten ships, it didn't take any action that would justify an immediate military response. It did something far more strategic. It started operating outside the pattern that sustains global control over that region. And that changes everything. Because power there was never just about military presence. It was always about predictability, about knowing who controls the flow, who guarantees security, and most importantly, who sets the rules. When that predictability is broken, even in a subtle way, the impact doesn't show up first on military radars. It shows up behind the scenes, in contracts, in purchasing decisions, in quiet negotiations between countries. And that's the critical point, because what looks like a simple, logistical detail may actually be signaling something much bigger. A real attempt to reconfigure control over one of the most strategic regions on the planet, without firing a single shot. To understand why this is so serious, you have to go back a few decades. Because what's being affected here isn't just a shipping route. It's an entire system that has sustained global power since the second half of the 20th century. After the oil crisis of the 1970s, especially following the 1973 oil crisis, the world realized something with brutal clarity. Whoever controls the flow of energy controls the economy. And that's when a quiet agreement began to shape the planet. The United States, aiming to stabilize the market while securing its own influence, built a strategic partnership with producing countries, especially Saudi Arabia. The mechanism was simple, but extremely powerful. Oil would be traded globally in dollars. And in return, there would be military protection, regional stability, and guaranteed flow through the Strait of Hormuz. That's how the system many call the petrodollar was born. And this system did something remarkable. It turned the dollar not just into a currency, but into the foundation of the entire global economy. Because if the world needs oil, and oil is sold in dollars, then the entire world needs dollars. Simple as that. For decades, this created a cycle of power that was nearly impossible to break. Countries buy energy, they need dollars, they strengthen the American economy, which, in turn, maintains military presence and influence over strategic routes. And Iran has always been an outlier in this system. Unlike other producers, Iran spent years under sanctions, economic pressure, and international isolation, precisely because it never fully aligned with this structure. But here's the most important detail. For a long time, despite tensions, the system was never truly challenged in a functional way. No one could operate outside of it without facing immediate consequences. Until now. Because what has started to happen recently suggests something that, until not long ago, seemed unlikely. Someone has found a way to bypass the system without confronting it directly. Now here comes the most important point of all, because what's happening doesn't look, at first glance, like a direct threat. But this is exactly how large systems begin to be dismantled. For decades, control over the Strait of Hormuz never depended only on military presence or who had more ships in the region. In reality, it worked because there was a pattern that everyone followed, almost like an unwritten rule. Oil moved within the same financial system, using the same currencies, the same intermediaries, and a level of predictability that kept everything under control. What Iran is starting to do now breaks that predictability. And that's the detail that changes everything. Because this isn't about closing the strait or provoking direct confrontation, but about allowing part of that flow to happen outside the traditional pattern, with more direct agreements, less dependence on the dollar, and, most importantly, less visibility within the system that has always controlled this type of operation. And the mechanism behind this is simpler than it seems. It doesn't require war, it doesn't require military superiority, and it doesn't require an immediate rupture. It only requires continuity. The moment this kind of operation happens once, it can be treated as an exception. When it happens again, it starts to be seen as an alternative. And when it begins to repeat frequently, it becomes a precedent. And that's when the system truly starts to weaken. Because power was never just about protecting the flow of energy, but about ensuring that no other viable way existed to do it. The moment countries begin to realize that parallel paths exist, even if still limited, control stops being absolute. And when that happens, the impact doesn't come explosively. It comes silently, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, but structurally. And this is exactly the kind of shift that, throughout history, redefines the global balance of power. Not when someone destroys the system, but when, little by little, they prove it's no longer indispensable. And the most important part is this. This is already happening in practice. It's not theory. In recent years, Iran has significantly increased its oil exports, especially to China, often using structures that bypass the traditional system, whether through alternative currencies or less visible channels. At the same time, countries inside and outside the OPEC have been adjusting their production and negotiation strategies, showing that the energy market is becoming less predictable and more political. And maybe the clearest signal is this: more and more transactions are happening outside the dominant pattern, quietly but consistently. It's not something that dominates the system yet, but it's already enough to prove one thing: the model that once seemed untouchable has started to be bypassed. Now it becomes clearer who is behind this movement. Iran has the strongest incentive to accelerate this shift, because it needs to bypass sanctions and survive outside the traditional system. Meanwhile, China plays a key role, seeking to secure energy while gradually reducing its dependence on the dollar-dominated model. On the other side, the United States remains the foundation of that system, and that's exactly why it is the most affected by any deviation, even small ones. At the same time, countries like Saudi Arabia are watching carefully, knowing that if this shift gains momentum, they will need to reposition quickly. At its core, this isn't a direct confrontation, it's a strategic game, where some are already moving, and others are still trying to keep everything as it is. And this is where things begin to escalate, because this kind of movement never stays isolated. When part of the oil trade starts happening outside the traditional system, the first impact shows up in currencies. Global demand for the dollar may begin to decline gradually, not abruptly, but enough to affect one of the key pillars of the international financial system. From there, the effect spreads into global trade. Countries begin testing bilateral agreements, alternative routes, and new payment methods. reducing reliance on traditional intermediaries and creating a much more fragmented landscape. In the energy sector, this completely shifts the balance. The flow becomes less predictable, decisions become more political than technical, and risk becomes a permanent part of the equation. And of course, this reaches alliances. Because when the system starts to change, countries don't stand still, they reposition. Some move closer to emerging powers, others try to reinforce existing ties, but all begin acting with greater caution. In the end, what started as a quiet move in the Strait of Hormuz stops being just a regional issue and starts influencing the global balance of power. And the most interesting, and at the same time most dangerous part, is that this transformation doesn't happen in a visible way. There's no exact moment when someone announces that the system has changed. It happens gradually, almost off the radar. Banks begin adapting their operations, creating ways to handle transactions outside the traditional circuit. Energy companies start accepting new terms, new currencies, new intermediaries, not out of ideology, but out of practical necessity. In international trade, more direct agreements emerge, less dependent on traditional structures. Routes are adjusted, contracts are rewritten, and before you realize it, part of the system is already functioning differently. And no one stops everything to debate it, because on the surface, everything still looks normal. Oil keeps flowing through the Strait of Hormuz, markets keep operating, economies keep moving. But underneath, the gears are no longer the same. And that's the critical point. Major shifts in global power rarely begin with visible disruptions. They begin like this, silent, gradual, almost imperceptible, until the moment there's no way back. And this is where time becomes more important than anything else. Because this kind of change doesn't need to dominate the entire system to become irreversible. It just needs momentum. If more countries begin testing these alternatives, if more deals are made outside the traditional framework, what looks isolated today can quickly turn into a trend. And once it becomes a trend, stopping it becomes far more difficult than preventing it in the first place. For the United States, this creates a clear dilemma. Acting too early could escalate tensions and accelerate the very process they're trying to contain. Acting too late could mean losing the ability to influence the system as before. Meanwhile, Iran and its partners gain something crucial: time to consolidate these routes, test limits, and turn exceptions into routine. And that's how structural change takes hold. Not through a single major event, but through a sequence of small decisions accumulated over time. The question now is no longer whether this can happen, it's how much time is left before this becomes the new normal. In the end, when you put all these pieces together, it becomes clear that what's happening isn't just about tension in the Middle East, nor is it just another episode involving Iran. What's at stake here is much bigger. For decades, the world has operated within a system where the flow of energy, financial power, and geopolitical influence were deeply interconnected, and above all, predictable. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was stable enough to sustain the global balance. What this silent move in the Strait of Hormuz reveals is that this stability may not be as solid as it once seemed. Because for the first time in a long time, we're not seeing an attempt to destroy the system head-on. We're seeing something more strategic, the construction of parallel pathways. And when those pathways start to work, even partially, the impact doesn't show up as an immediate collapse. It shows up as a gradual loss of control. The conflict we see with ships, tensions, and official statements is just the surface. The real shift is happening underneath, in the way the world trades, pays, transports, and depends on energy. And maybe this is the most important part to understand. Ships are still passing, oil is still flowing, the world still appears the same. But the system that held all of this together may no longer be the same.